Asking the questions mainstream journalists will never ask. This is your Richie Allen Show on richieallen.co.uk, Fab Radio 2 in Manchester, and triggerwarning.tv.
Now, this is serious stuff. The Culture Secretary today called on more schools to ban mobile phones. Matt Hancock said he admired those head teachers who did not allow their use during the school day, and he linked social media use with the problem of bullying among young children. Now, many teachers have spoken at parent-teacher conferences all over the country about how they feel using phones to surf the web or whatever is causing even lack of concentration in children, maybe issues with memory and more besides. And we heard today from a teacher called Greg Davies at Ship Lake College, who basically has taken the decision to ban phones from the classroom and from the school as well. This comes in the year that the World Health Organization has decided to list gaming, addiction to gaming, as a serious health issue, and we've talked a lot about that in recent weeks as well. Let's welcome back to the programme Dr. Phil Reid. Now, Phil was on this show last year. Terrific conversation we had with Phil. He's a professor in psychology from the College of Human and Health Sciences at Swansea, and he's a veritable expert in this subject. I will tweet out links to papers published by Phil and also to news articles that have featured his comments. Phil, welcome back to the programme. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Richie. Thanks very much for having me back. That was a wonderful build-up. I'm not quite sure I recognise myself from that.
You deserve it. You're like me. We have one thing in common this summer. Two Celts. None of our national teams is in the World Cup, sadly. So
I know. It is a tragedy.
It is a tragedy. And you know, if you ask the Russian Interior Ministry, we could do with the Welsh and the Irish. We sing a lot, we drink a lot, and then we go home happy. Nothing wrong with that. Now, Phil, this is deadly serious. Since we last spoke, and it was a great chat last year, thousands and thousands of retweets with YouTube and Podomatic, huge interest in it. A lot of our, it seems that we have a very young audience, people who've got young children. What about the World Health Organization and gaming? I'm guessing you think that by them listing that as a serious disorder, I would guess, Phil, you think that's a good thing.
It is a good thing insofar as it goes, yes. It's a step in the right direction, and we're seeing lots of steps in the right direction. Now we have the digital minister and the health minister all making the right kind of noises, the World Health Organization recognizing that this particular issue is problematic for anything between 0.5% and 1% of the population, which is a huge amount of people who are being disrupted in terms of their life by a particular behavior. That's all great, and we should welcome that, plus all of the other bits of news that you've been talking about in the introduction. They're all positive steps. The difficulty is we're still only talking officially about internet gaming disorder, which is not quite the same thing as digital dependence in general. It's not quite the same as an internet disorder per se. And I think the latter, people who are addicted to the internet or digital devices, are a much larger proportion than those people who are just using that as a platform in order to game.
That's really good, Phil. It's not just about gaming, it's about internet usage in general. And the head teacher I mentioned, Greg Davies, when he was speaking on Sky News today, he said that he's seen studies and evidence peer-reviewed. There's a probability, he's read your work, Phil, that more than 50% of children are addicted to the internet. And he talked about them not being able to not check their phone for a ping or a beep that might take them to Facebook or to Twitter. And he also said something interesting. The Sky News presenter was a bit niggly and was trying to kind of get stuck into him. And he said, well, I was in the green room earlier on, and you've got a lot of young staff here, young, early 20-somethings. They couldn't even eat a sausage roll or a sandwich, and they had their phones in their hand. Do you recognise that, Phil? Is it more than half the population, more than half of children who are actually addicted to the stuff?
Well, I probably wouldn't put it quite that high. From the studies that we've done, mainly on young people, probably late teenagers, we would say somewhere around a third are showing moderate signs of problematic internet use, problematic digital use. And what we mean by that is that they feel that they're using it too much and it's disrupting other aspects of their life. That's not quite the same as a full-blown internet addiction. That's more like a habit or a compulsion, which can still be very disruptive and very harmful, but it's not quite the same as an addiction, for which you would need withdrawal effects when you're not accessing the digital device, and also tolerance. That means that you'd need more and more of it over time. But we're just quibbling now over the nature of the problem, whether it's a compulsion, whether it's an addiction. The bottom line is there is a problem, however it's caused, and it is affecting a large chunk of the population, and whether that's 10% or whether it's 25% or whether it's 50%, those figures are extraordinarily high compared to the effects that, say, something like gambling or one of the more recognized psychological disorders might have on the population. To put that into context, around 1% of the population have an autistic spectrum disorder, and we're talking 25% maybe have some mild form of addiction, and maybe 5-6% have a full-blown internet addiction. We're talking 5 times the number of people showing a problem related to digital technology than have a problem with almost any other form of psychological or behavioral problem.
The work you've done on this is groundbreaking. We got into it last year because I'm very interested in it. I'm more interested in it than I can say, really. And you've written about and published on what it's doing to the brain physiologically, what it's doing to the neural pathways and the negative impacts it's having. Talk about that, Phil, in layman's terms. How is it transforming our brains physically, and what sort of behaviours is that then leading to that you can observe?
Yeah, well, what you see is on an observable level with people who have high levels of digital dependence is they tend to have impulse control problems, and that goes with people who are addicted to most things. They have social difficulties interacting with people. They tend to have high levels of depression and emotional dysregulation problems. And they also show higher levels of physical disorders, so they get ill more often. Now, how that's coming about, the most likely scenario is that internet use, when you stop using those devices, is associated with a stressful withdrawal. When you get that kind of stress, a number of things happen. One of them is you get a release of a hormone called cortisol. Now, cortisol has multiple effects. It will impact on different brain regions. It's known that it impacts on an area called the amygdala, which is involved in emotional regulation. It's known to damage the hippocampal area, which is involved in memory formation. And it also is involved in changes to the prefrontal cortex, which are involved in things like attentional control and impulse control and many of those higher functions. And in addition to those impacts on brain function, it also has a suppressive effect on our immune systems. And you tend to find that, as you know, everyone knows from experience, if you're stressed, then you tend to be susceptible to illness. And that's what you find with people who are addicted, in the sense they get withdrawal effects to digital devices. That's the most likely scenario of what's happening. Now, we know all of those brain regions are in fact affected by heavy use of the internet. We know that all of those observable behaviors are there in people who have internet problems. And this just seems like the most likely pathway for that to be affected.
And you've looked into whether or not these impacts you've just described, whether they're reversible or not. And it's a bit early to say, Phil, is it?
It is a bit early to say. Probably it will depend on how far gone that addiction is. Most addictions are reversible. There are very good treatment strategies for addictions. We know that with almost anything, and anyone who is addicted is almost certain to be able to be helped to overcome that addiction. It's not an easy process by any means, and it requires looking at not just what's driving the addiction itself, but what are the other factors in that person's life? Why are they driven to indulge in this particular activity to such an extent? And that's true of any addiction. That's true of a substance addiction, that's true of nicotine, that's true of gambling, and it's true of digital devices. It's not just the devices themselves. You've got to look at the broader context of the person's life. What is it they're trying to get from this substance or this activity that they're not getting from the rest of their life? Or why is their life so horrible that they've got to escape by using these particular substances or behaviors? So you have to look at the totality of the situation. But yes, these things can be reversible. The brain is plastic, the brain changes over time, and generally, if it goes one way, you can get round it or you can make it go the other way. It has to be extremely severe for not to be reversible.
Dr. Phil Reid is our guest. Phil's a professor in psychology from the College of Human and Health Sciences at Swansea. We're talking about internet addiction and how it's changing us physiologically, but also how it's changing our behaviours and what the consequences of that might be. But you talk about getting people to pull back from it, Phil, yet increasingly almost on a week by week or month by month basis. Everything we do is moving into the cybersphere, isn't it? It really is. And
it is.
That's huge, that. And I was listening to a doctor. I'm shocked that I can't remember his surname because I've mentioned him several times now. But he's looking into this in terms of he's treating children specifically with gaming disorders, which is only one function of it. Dr. Richard from Nightingale in London. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes, yeah.
And he was on Sky News the other day, and I wanted to murder the presenter because he said something very interesting, and the presenter didn't pick him up on it because, as usual, they're not listening. They're looking down a list of questions. And he actually said something about we need to look into whether the internet companies and the gaming companies are doing things. What are they doing, to make things addictive in the way that they are? And of course, the same question then deserves to go to the internet in general. Are companies and providers, are they aware of things they can do to keep people online longer and, constantly checking their laptops, their tablets, or their devices, Phil? Are they doing things that, are they aware of things they can do to engage with?
I think the answer is of course. That's the business that they're in. And that's what all businesses will do. They're looking at their bottom line, and that's what they care about. They are in the business of getting as many people using this device for as long as possible so they can sell advertising. That's what they are doing. That's how they make their money. So, of course, they do that. There's a huge amount of research that's done in those companies. And if you see people who have worked for internet companies, many of them will say that much of their time is spent looking at ways to make the device more attractive. And this is not only true of internet gaming companies, it's true of all gambling companies. They will try to make their gaming machines as attractive as possible. And that's what the companies do, and that's the difficulty that any regulatory board has. Whether it's the government, whether it's the World Health Organization, any responsible body has to take their time. They can't rush into making a proclamation or to making a piece of legislation that's a knee-jerk reaction. They have to consider the evidence, they have to weigh it up, they have to ask people. At the moment, there's a consultation going on about social media and the effects on children's social health. evidence is being given to the House of Commons. This all takes time. Companies who run digital platforms do not have to act responsibly. They do not have to act slowly and take their time and ponder. All they have to do is make money. That leaves us with a great problem in that we're constantly playing catch-up on a very unfair playing field, where you have on the one side people who are trying to make responsible decisions which are not restrictive for people's freedom. Nobody wants to restrict anybody's freedom, but at the same time you want to protect people. And on the other side, people who have no such issues. So they're well ahead of the game in knowing how to make these things addictive, how to make them extremely attractive. And the problem is, going back to the gaming disorder, it's almost a day short and a dollar late. Sorry, the other way around. This was a problem, a major problem, when gaming is what you did on the internet. And maybe 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, that was the major source of negative impact. But it's not anymore. It's social media. That's really the thing that's addicting our youngsters to these devices.
Yeah, it is social media.
I think that's a different thing to gaming.
It's a completely different thing. Of course, I'm not in your field. I can't claim to have that knowledge, but I'm pretty sure it is completely different. Loads of questions flying in on that. Phil's going to stay with me for another 10, maybe 15 minutes. If Phil can stay with us to the top of the hour. Can you stay with us to the top of the hour, Phil?
I would love to if you want to have me.
Please, stay with us till 8 o'clock because there's some really interesting questions coming in. Are we seeing, amongst those most addicted to the internet, let's put it, catch all the internet, including gaming, are we seeing a dumbing down of people? Are we seeing people a little bit less smart? Are we seeing their critical thinking faculties affected? That's come in from a number of listeners.
We're certainly seeing a reduction in their cognitive abilities in terms of their level of sustained attention, their ability to modulate attention and, I suppose, develop a longer rational argument. That's certainly true. We're also seeing effects at the level of short-term memory, a difficulty in encoding information. There may be some benefits that you also see, some changes, shall we say, from this different way of processing information. But on the whole, it's fairly damaging at that cognitive level. So attentional problems, reasoning abilities are being changed, and probably not for the better.
Here's a question for you now, and this is coming in from a listener. I was going to ask you this anyway. It's a tad conspiratorial, but not that much. Don't panic, Phil. It's very interesting, this, because you've got people like Elon Musk all the time talking about how eventually we'll all be connected to the cloud. Now, I know you've heard all about this and you've read all about this. And last year we saw workers in a company in Wisconsin allowing themselves to be microchipped so that they could access a vending machine. This is a fact. There's a lot of talk about this. A lot of people pushing this stuff. Silicon Valley companies, of course, and they're saying, eventually we'll all be hooked up. The BBC ran a story the other day. Cash payments are disappearing. People are going cashless, tapping the card. But in a couple of years' time, they won't be tapping the card. It'll all be on the smartphone. We're doomed, Phil. Aren't we?
It is very disturbing.
Yeah.
And the key issues here are individual freedom and responsibility. We don't all want to go down this route. And to have it imposed is clearly a violation of basic human rights. To have it imposed by companies just for their own benefit is adding yet another layer of insult, I suppose, onto this driver. And I think we've got to be very wary of just accepting these things. There was a very interesting program narrated by Morgan Freeman a few years ago on this notion of chipping employees, and there was a chap over in Switzerland who had demonstrated that by doing this, firms are actually making themselves much more vulnerable, because if you were so minded, you could place a virus into the chip that's inserted in you, which would then leap into the company's system and take that system down. The more we have these digital checks, the more vulnerable we become to that type of cybersecurity breach. And I think we have to be very, very cautious about going down this route. Plus the fact that it creates a major digital divide. Older people in our society are still struggling with this. Even people in their 60s and their 70s. They're not brought up with this technology. The world is changing rapidly around them, and they're struggling to deal with this. We're actually preventing them from engaging in society. Now, this is not an issue about wealth or class. It's an issue about age. And it's artificially creating barriers, excluding groups of individuals from our society because of these external drivers. And these are all coming from private companies. This is not something that we have voted for or signed up to or agreed as a society to do. It's almost just been imposed on us. And I think those are the societal debates over and above the psychological and physiological effects, which is my area, that we really need to have.
We do, yeah. I mean, I'm 43 now, and when I was in my early 20s, yeah, we had the internet and we had email, but that was about it, and you didn't spend any time online. I'm old enough to remember Encarta, the encyclopedia, and sometimes I would use that to check something out, but I never ever envisaged that we'd see what we see today with people online so many hours a day, you know, whether it's on the bus, using their phone to go online. Mr. Sin has tweeted, I mean, we've had a lot of tweets on this. It's at Richie Allen Show on Twitter. Mr. Sin tweets, Richie, is it internet addiction or phone addiction? Is there a distinction? The reason I ask is because I know several people who are constantly sending messages and ignoring people around them. Is there a distinction to be made between the devices that people use in terms of their level of addiction, Phil?
I think the issue with mobile devices is it's made it much easier to access the digital world, and that spreads the possibilities for engaging with the digital world. So I'm not convinced that people are ever addicted to their phone per se, that they'll take their phone out and fondle it just because they like doing that, although I'm sure there are some people who do, you know. But I don't think that's the main issue here. It's the device that they're using to connect to the digital world in order to access the thing that they really are addicted to, whether that's the social media, whether that's the gaming apps, whether that's the pornography, whatever it is. The mobile devices have just allowed it to be much, much more widespread.
Here's a question for you, Phil. By the way, let me just remind our listeners, I'm delighted you came back, Phil, by the way. I should have invited you back sooner. Dr. Phil Reid is on the programme tonight. Not many people like Phil. Groundbreaking research into the effects of internet addiction on us, the physical effects and the emotional and psychological effects as well. Phil is a professor, as I said, at bring it up here, Phil. It's amazing, isn't it? I said it 1,000 times today in my head. Talking to us live from Swansea, by the way, is Phil, and he's at the Health Sciences Department in the college in Swansea. Yes, what's wrong with me, Phil? It's all this internet addiction. That's what it is. He's a professor in psychology.
No, it's true. It's affecting us all.
It's affecting every one of us. The College of Human and Health Sciences, of course, in Swansea. This is things. I've got 3 things I want to say to you, and 3 things at one time. I'm going to ask you these 3 questions. First of all, Phil, you know I've had a couple of academics on the program in the last few months from different universities. One of the things they say that social media obsession is doing is it's creating an echo chamber for people of all ages who surround themselves online with people who agree with them, so they never have arguments. And this has led to a kind of a narcissistic tendency. But it's also led to, wait for it, at universities and at colleges, people no platforming speakers, people freaking out because somebody said something they don't agree with. Phil, in your time, I mean, you're a professor, you're a PhD, top man, are you noticing that people are becoming less tolerant to the opinions of others and are losing their ability to robustly debate people, even those that they find offensive? Go ahead.
On the whole, I think that people do retain that ability. There is a vociferous minority who are very, very vocal who don't. And that's what we hear about. I think you're absolutely right, and your contributors who have said this are absolutely right to say that people don't go looking for disagreements when they're online. They do surround themselves by reinforcing comments, and they will just ignore the things that are not reinforcing to them. So there is that tendency there. I think the one crumb of comfort that we can take is that I think on the whole people are still quite happy to debate. And that's been my experience. I haven't really come across the notion that we should not debate issues that we find offensive. Luckily, that doesn't seem to happen very much where I am. Nevertheless, you can see that there is a growing tendency which gets very well publicized in the media. I think perhaps a little bit out of proportion to... Maybe
exaggerated, Phil. Maybe exaggerated.
I think it is. It's troubling. It is troubling that we do have this, but I think we've got to be careful not to exaggerate the impact of these individuals, because it's almost giving them too much of a platform themselves.
Yeah, fair enough. Alf on Twitter, by the way, says he's delighted to hear Phil say that this addiction is more related to social media maybe than actual gaming. Gaming isn't productive for relationships or for eating, says Alf, but it can be fun, and fun is in capital letters. And Jen Crosby, who's listening to the program, not on the Pacific coast, I think she's on the East Coast of the US, is laughing at my short-term memory trouble there, trying to recall Phil's college. Phil, I'm going to go...
It's cruel to mock.
Yeah, it's cruel to mock. Don't mock. Yeah, but I can take it. I'm not a snowflake. You can abuse me all you want. Now, I said this to you last year, and I absolutely respect that you don't agree with me. Now, I'm not saying that I believe that the governments and the intelligence agencies have designed all this. I'm not, Phil. Of course, I'm not saying that. But they certainly benefit from it. You know, I mean, there was a brilliant article in The Guardian about 2 years ago on this theme of moving into a completely digital age. And there was a kind of a half a conspiratorial article. I should remember the author, but again, it's my short-term memory gone. But it was basically saying that, control is going to be very easy for those that might wish to control us, Phil, should we continue down this road.
Yes, it is. And I think that is a broader societal concern. The more that we move to things like having smart meters in our homes, the more that everything we do is monitored on the internet, then the easier it is to gain some level of control. And that is absolutely true. And I think we do need to recognize this and not be complicit in allowing this to happen. We've got to remember that we are all still free agents. We all still can choose to conduct ourselves either in the real world or the virtual world. We don't have to sign up for all of the devices that are offered to us, because these devices will come at some cost, even though they are fun. And I agree that social media can be great fun. It's good to talk to your friends that way. No one's suggesting it isn't. It's quite useful to be able to pay all your bills online if you want to. But when that's the only game in town, and there's a complete monopoly of the way we can conduct ourselves, then I think we have difficulties. So I don't buy the, we've had this conversation before, I don't buy the conspiratorial view of it, largely because that would require a great deal of competence, and I don't really see much of that.
I love this, Phil. I love this, the old incompetence argument. I always get this thrown in my face. They're not that clever, Richie. You know, I sadly think they might be, but I absolutely respect your opinion on that. Phil, when I say that the work you're doing is, not only is it groundbreaking, but it's vital, I mean it. I'm glad there are still men and women like you at third level institutions doing this work, because it is vital. I'm going to give you the final word, Phil. I would say, and I've written a couple of, I'm not the greatest writer, but I've written a couple of articles on this on my own website about the phones and that. I'm not yet, I haven't yet been blessed with children. My partner and I would love to have children. You know, please God, we will. I would try and keep them away from the phones, Phil. I don't know how easy that's going to be in the next 10, 15 years, but I think no good can come of pre-teen children spending all their times not just playing games, but, you know, surfing the internet on their phones, on Google, on whatever. I think it's no good can come of it. Final word to you, and thanks again for coming back on.
Yeah, I would really agree with that last comment. I think it is very important that parents manage to keep their children, especially pre-teens, away from these devices. They can damage psychologically. And frankly, we don't yet know the full physical implications of low-wave microwave radiation. I would certainly keep very young children away from them, introduce them to the real world, not the digital world.
Phil, it was a real pleasure. Thanks for doing it again. I really appreciate you spending time with us this evening. Thanks, Phil. And I will be in touch with you again in the autumn for more on this, because it's very important.
Thanks a lot, Richie.
Lovely to have you on, Phil. Thanks. Bye for now. That was the brilliant Dr. Phil Reid. Phil's a professor in psychology at the College of Human and Health Sciences at Swansea. I've tweeted a couple of links to articles about Phil and information on the website there, swansea.ac.uk. If you have young children, share this interview when it's on YouTube tomorrow, when it's on Podomatic tomorrow. Get them listening to this. This is not a conspiracy theorist. This is an academic, a learned, qualified man who's telling you things that you really need to know if you've got young children. Phil Reid, top man. Great to have him back on the programme.